r/AskReddit. Former spoiled rotten kids. When did the real world really hit you? I've had an odd experience. I grew up in extreme wealth, then went to living very humbly. I'm half Saudi, so I had maids all my young life. Practically wiped my ass. I remember whenever me and my bros got off the airplane and we were driven to the executive gold lounge. Basically, we were minted. However, my parents got divorced and my mother decided rightly I should live with her back in the UK. So I went from maids in a mansion, where my bedroom was bigger than most people's entire floor, in the UK at least, to sharing a tiny bedroom with my brothers. I remember my first time washing dishes at school, and I did it with cold water and the other students laughed and said you're supposed to do it with warm/hot water. I went from buying whatever I wanted to buying second-hand school clothes, but it was the best thing to happen to me ever, because holy shit, when I went back and met some of my old friends, their minds, they were just not normal people. This is when it really hit me, because I just saw how different they were. Fully grown men being catered for by maids in their old age. Do they have no shame? Rich coming from me, but hey, I mended my ways. Whenever I visit my father, I see my stepbro who continued being spoiled. 35-year-old man, never had a job, leeches off his mum. Our maid is like 60, she cleans his clothes, washes his dishes, might as well squeeze his arse cheeks whilst he takes a shit. I refuse to let the maid do anything, and I'd give where I can from money I earned. To see such a difference is what made me grateful and hit me. I'm so fucking glad I didn't continue growing up spoiled. Frankly, I didn't grow up poor either. My perspective of poverty was warped compared to real poverty. Our tiny shared bedroom was luxury. I've learned never to take anything for granted. I'm so glad I grew up normally. I couldn't stand the person I'd become if I continued growing up spoiled. I work hard now. I support my mother. I have pride, something I'd never have if I continued being a leech. I was spoiled rotten until my mid-20s. My parents gave me anything I wanted. When a new gaming generation came out, I would get every system and essentially every launch game. In high school, I drove nicer cars than all of my classmates' parents, and I had 3 different cars depending on how I felt. 2 of them were brand new sports cars, and the other was an older, but very desirable sports car. I never paid for gas or insurance. Never paid a phone bill. Didn't pay for food, movies, snacks, anything. I was given almost limitless amounts of money to spend on whatever I wanted. My parents paid for my college tuition, and I later worked in the family business and was paid a very good wage for being simply who I was. I wasn't a slouch, Paresi, but I had a false sense of security due to things being handed to me for years. My perspective of life was that you are always on an upwards trajectory to earn more. I swore that by 25 I would own a Lamborghini and a $500,000 house, at least. Anything less than that would be an abysmal failure. While living in this excess, I met a girl who grew up poor. She didn't live in poverty, but she had to work since a very young age and had to help pay the family's bills. Basically, she lived a life that I deathly feared. Her financial situation stabilized by the time we started dating, but her life experience gave her a pretty solid background. I initially approached our relationship from a position of wanting to give her the finer things in life. I spent thousands of my parents' money on her to take her on trips and buy her jewelry. She was never comfortable with it and frequently said that she is fine with a cheap dinner and a movie. She and I got married and were expecting a child soon after. My great awakening came when the family business fell to pieces. Suddenly the endless supply of money stopped. It was so bad that I couldn't even receive a salary and had to look for a job. I had a college degree, but really no discernible skill set. Finding a job wasn't the easiest thing in the world for me to do. I eventually found a very entry-level job in a completely different field. The salary was incredibly low by any measure. For the first time, had to pay for gas, insurance, phone, food, etc. The high-performance car I drove took premium fuel and got abysmal gas mileage. I sold it and bought the cheapest car I could find that was safe and new enough to keep my family on the road. I never drove anything so cheap in my life, was never paid so little, and had to pay bills for the first time in my life. I had to perform at work because I was almost literally living paycheck to paycheck. Oh yeah, I racked up tons of credit card debt being irresponsible and knowing I could easily pay it until I couldn't. My one constant? My wife was unflappable. She had been in far worse situations before. She was pregnant yet calm, cool, and collected despite the sudden life change. She didn't stress and essentially pulled up her sleeves and devised a budget for the household to see us through our new reality. It was clear why we were put together. I thought I was the man. Look who ended up taking care of who. This experience taught me that money literally didn't matter. Not only does it not matter, but it can disappear in an instant. I became closer with my wife, new son, and my faith after this experience. I wouldn't change it for the world. Edit. Thank you for the gold. By developed nation standards, I don't have much. Never have. Buying food and paying rent has always come with varying degrees of difficulty. But my partner had an experience that made me realize I'm still spoiled rotten in many senses. My partner took what we considered to be a shitty job at the time, working a pretty physically demanding position at a large nursery for low pay with long hours. One day he noticed a new guy in the lunchroom. The guy was wearing a suit, totally unsuited to the work, and standing in front of the microwave staring at it, seemingly with no idea what to do. At the time my partner thought he must have just been a bit simple. A couple of days later he got talking to this guy and heard his story. He was a young man from Sudan who had been at home with his family when militia came calling. They made certain demands of his father, who refused to comply, and in response they beheaded the father right in front of his family. While this was happening, he managed to gather up his brother, mother, and sister and escape. They ran away, and in time they made it to a refugee camp. They stayed in the camp for some time, but he feared for the safety of his mother and sister. He and his brother decided they would have to strike out and make an attempt to reach the UN and the neighboring country. They left on foot to try and make it, but had no shoes while traveling through the jungle full of scrub he described as being like razors, severely lacerating their feet. They even had to run from lions along the way. Eventually, in very bad shape, they made it to the UN, who took them in. They said they could arrange asylum for the brothers, but all they had was one place in the US and one in Australia. They had no choice but to accept, and so they were split up. The brother that went to Australia begged to have his mother and sister brought over too, as he believed it was only a matter of time until something bad happened to them in the refugee camp. He was told he would need to get and hold a job for a certain amount of time to show he was legitimate. Then later he may be able to bring his family over. He was provided with a small allowance to arrange clothing and transportation so he could get a job, with which he purchased an old suit and bicycle from an op shop. Thrift store I think they are called in the US. He was set up with a job as part of a program whereby businesses can pay staff less if they are willing to take on refugees. He wasn't told what the job was, however, so he put on his suit and rode his bike to his new job. And that was the day my partner first saw him in the lunchroom. He was staring at the microwave because he had never ever used one before and had no idea what to do with it. When telling my partner his story, he explained how crucial this job was for him, that he believed the life of his mother and sister depended on it. A few days later my partner went to work and found out the young man had been fired. The business, despite having wages subsidized in order to help provide training, decided he was learning too slowly. So now, when I'm struggling to pay my rent or bills, but I'm doing so from the safety of my home having eaten 3 square meals, I think of the young man from Sudan's story, and I'm thankful for everything I have. I grew up living in a huge hotel. Kind of like your Sweet Life of Zack and Cody thing, except that I was a spoiled young kid. When I was 7, I'd have a nanny put on my socks, wear my school uniform every day, etc. I had 4 nannies before that, and they all left. I made one cry once because I yelled at her for not helping me with my math homework. I slapped another one. She left 3 months later. It hit me hard a year or 2 later when my dad had to travel overseas to work, so I was stuck with that one particular nanny named Tina. My dad didn't really send a lot of money back to us, and so we had to live in a cramped apartment since we needed to move out of that particular hotel. I hated my nanny at the beginning because she was just so damn strict. Turns out that she was doing this because she wanted us to change, and we did. Because my dad didn't send enough money and didn't want to. Stingy guy. We had to ration our food on some days and I couldn't go to many school activities because we didn't have a car like we used to and we didn't have enough money. This was hard on my brother and I because we went to a private international school, so it was really hard not trying to show others our personal struggle. It was even harder on me as I was a prefect at that school, and so not attending school activities / extracurricular stuff was the worst. During that period, I learned so much and begun to empathize properly. I learned to socialize with my neighbors, be independent, and this made me enjoy my childhood living in that apartment more than I ever did living in a hotel. I owe it all to my nanny, to be honest. I consider her my surrogate mom now regardless of the rough beginning, and I honest to God would not have changed one single bit if it wasn't for her. I was a spoiled kid, but not really by money. Grew up middle class, had a TV, northeasts, bike, and would get a couple $100 in clothes at the start of each school year. I wasn't necessarily the rich kid. There were always richer kids in the school, but we were pretty well off. My dad was a self-employed lawyer, mom was licensed as a nurse, but became a SAHM when us kids were born. My dad was always involved in our childhood. Because he was self-employed, he ended up being the dad who was always the soccer coach, the football coach, came to all our games. In high school I was on the football team and the wrestling team, and he was at every match, knew the score of every game. My core group of friends were the wrestling team and we would always come over to my house to hang out. My dad had set up the family room and the garage as a place for us to hang out. Years later my dad admitted he'd intentionally set it up that way, so he'd know where we were, and so we'd stay out of trouble. One friend, whom I will call Andy because that was his name, had a father who never came to any of the wrestling matches, even on weekends. I never really understood why parents wouldn't show up to see their kids playing various sports. I just didn't get it. In my head that's what parents did. When we were about 17, Andy started having some problems. Long story short, he ended up killing himself. During one of our hangouts at the house, we got to talking about it as 17 years olds might, and I said how I didn't understand why he didn't talk it out with his parents. My friends had to explain it to me very slowly, several times, that Andy's dad was an asshole and Andy didn't have the kind of relationship I had with my parents. My parents were always there for me, supportive not just with money, but with their time and attention. That was the day I found out that not all parents are like that. Today, some of my friends still drop by my parents' house for a visit and a chat. It wasn't until that moment, when I was 17, that I realized that not everyone was as lucky to have parents like them. Years later I also found out that my parents supported my friends, not just as parental figures, but also helped them with tuition to college and some damn good legal advice in several situations. They made everyone's lives better by being a part of it. TL, doctor, awesome supportive parents taken for granted. Friend committed suicide. Realized how lucky I'm to have great parents. Not sure if this is a serious question, but here's a serious answer. When I moved out of my hometown for college, it was an absolute culture shock. I met other students who couldn't go to their dream schools because of how much it cost, so they had to go in-state. They didn't eat out every other day. They bought second-hand clothes. Some had never traveled out of the country, some never even out of the state. Some were driving their parents' first cars. That shit blew my mind. This is how the rest of the 99% of the country lives. I come from a filthy rich background, but I work hard to hide it, so that you can't tell. I dress normally. I don't really talk about my background. I try to buy stuff on sale. Sometimes it shows in ways that I can't help. I'd never seen shitty cars before going to college. I don't know how to drive cars with poor handling, and I always forget to turn off the headlights because I've never driven a car without automatic lights. I don't know how much anything costs because it doesn't matter. I'll still buy it anyway. I also don't really value money. $100 just isn't a big deal to me, but I know it means a lot to others, so I don't mind giving it to friends who are in need. But if you don't look too closely at my habits, you can't tell. And that was a conscious decision that I've made. I'm grateful for never having to worry about money, and I likely never will. But I don't want to go back to my hometown because I think the lifestyle is unhealthy. There's so much entitlement, and the worst part is how rich people think that money defines your worth. I've seen them look at people with less money with such disdain, like their value as a person is less, since they don't have as much money. It's disgusting. And I don't want to be associated with that kind of person. I also loathe the comments that come with it like, if I were rich like you. And I put an end to those immediately if they come up. I don't like being treated differently because of how much money I have, and I won't treat you differently for how much money you have. We are both people, and we are both worth something. While my family was not super rich, I certainly never wanted for any material things as a child. We had a pool, basketball court, computers, video game systems, pool table, pinball machine and a train set that took up half the basement. We vacationed on Cape Cod. On Christmas, presents would be literally piled floor to ceiling on one end of the living room. Childhood heaven, right? Wrong. As I hit the preteen years, I noticed that, while my parents showered us with all these things, what they didn't give us was them. For them, work always came first. Being raised by my babsy, my parents both owned businesses plus worked other jobs. Family time often entailed me working in one of their stores. On a couple of occasions, I was even pulled out of school in order to work on something for them. Things came to a head when I was 11 or 12, I believe. I wish I could be more specific, but I've blocked out a lot from that period of my life. It was Christmas, and the presents were, as usual, piled so high as to threaten an avalanche onto us. In the previous weeks, the realization had really hit me about the family dynamics. It was then I did something either very smart or very stupid. I stood up on the couch in the den, crossed my arms defiantly, and yelled, "You can't buy my love." I got the shit beaten out of me for that one. One of many times in my childhood, but those are stories for another day. I realized that, while I had all those physical things, I didn't have them. I had no clue what love actually felt like, especially the type to come from a family. From then on, I was numb inside whenever it came to those feelings. Many years later, I had another incident that reinforced just how dysfunctional this episode had left me. After the above childhood episode, I pretty much stopped celebrating any holidays for over 20 years. Prodding from a close friend got me to give things another try. I would spend several Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays with his wife and kids/stepkids. Things actually started to go pretty well. We would cook huge meals for not only his direct family, but their parents, cousins, etc. One Christmas, however, hit me like a ton of bricks. Their family was gathered in their living room, sitting around and opening presents. I was leaning against a doorway watching the activities. At one point, the conversation involved talking with the kids about how families get together at that time of year, and my friend's daughter asked why I was there then. Her grandmother, a real sweetheart, without skipping a beat, said he's practically adopted. I should have felt a swelling feeling of warmth and thankfulness that I was so accepted by their family. Instead, it was like a glass wall was there. I could see what was going on, study it, understand the logic behind it all, but childhood had numbed me to where I couldn't actually feel anything. I should have been extremely happy, but instead I wanted to curl up in a ball and die. I was openly and publicly accepted by this family, one that thought enough of me that I was a pallbearer at her husband's funeral a few years later, but I never learned how to let the feelings in, even though I wanted to so badly. Fast forward several more years. In the past 5 years I finally moved completely out from under my family's thumb. The more toxic aspects I have cut off entirely. I got roommates, then my own place. I lost a pile of weight, 180 pounds, and took up country line dancing. I felt like my life was finally starting. Then something new happened. I fell in love. I wasn't even sure what I was feeling. I had absolutely no reference to go by. I wasn't even looking for a relationship. She had sought me out. Over these past 2 years, I've finally begun to learn what it is like to not only love, but the feeling of being loved. All the concepts I never learned from my own family as a child finally began to come to me decades later. It's not just her. Her family has welcomed me with open arms, treating me as one of their own. A part of me keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, to have the rug pulled out from under me in the cruelest ways imaginable. I know I shouldn't feel this way, and it is a work in progress. We are getting married this September. It took 30 years, but I finally managed to recover from the spoiled child phase of my life and the fallout of realizing just what kind of life I was living. I always thought I was the shit. I was told I was the best looking kid in my class and the smartest. I was in the gifted program in elementary school and lauded that over all the other kids. I took an IQ test when I was 12 and did the same thing. I was an asshole to anyone and everyone because it was entertaining to me. I think my justification was that it would make them more prepared for people like me in the real world. I was a dick. I lived in a massive house on a hill and would literally spit gum on the floor for maids to clean up. Yes, I had multiple maids. When I was 14, I took LSD with my brother's friends. I sat awake the whole night and listened to one of these college kids tell me about how I was no fucking different from any other kid who was handed everything, and soon enough I would be handed my ass. He said I would likely never catch up to the kids in my class who really cared about what they were doing with their time. He told me to sit and really think about how I talked to people, what I did in my day-to-day life, my expectations of what I would accomplish in life, and how those matched up with what was really important behind the facade I called me. He pointed out how awkward and embarrassing I was, and how annoying people must find me, or rather how little they cared. I wanted to hate him for brutally pointing out all my biggest flaws, but I ended up loving him for being able to see through my bullshit. It was like my life, my self-image was a tangle of wires that he forced me to untie so that they could actually be used. It sounds dramatic and corny, but I died that day, and when I woke up I had become a real person. I was so much less confused. I was no longer a delusional, superficial, egomaniacal piece of shit. I realized that morning what people actually thought of me at school, and I apologized to a lot of them for various things. The next Monday the look on their faces was complete shock. An apology from him. I also knew what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to save lives, not human lives, plants, animals, all the inhabitants of this planet that don't behave like a disease on a macro scale. Being a rock star, or whatever, a famous writer maybe, was out of the question. I no longer gave a fuck about myself or my image at all in comparison to what I felt for all the other living things on this planet that deserve our love and respect, and I still feel that way 10 years later. I used to be the exact opposite of this, but I rarely get irritated at people, make assumptions, expect anything from anyone, or run away from responsibility. I don't feel like I have to win an argument. I don't want to get rich to retire early. I don't lie to myself, and I constantly surprise people with the truth. I know I'm nowhere near the best, and I look for lessons from anyone and everyone, because I know everyone knows more than I do. I found out that one of my friends who goes to school here on visa told me that she had no choice but to go to a community college despite being with the top 5 of the class, because college fees for international students are way too expensive, especially for her, since her parents are by no means wealthy. This shook me up really hard, because despite the fact I was also one of the better students, all I had to do in regards of picking out colleges is pick which one I like the best and watch my parents pay for it, regardless of it being public or private, because my parents simply can afford to do that. The other time that I was knocked into reality was when my close friend's mom died, and she revealed that she and her brother had to be pulled out of private school education after the semester ended because they were so behind on payments due to medical fees, quit the sports she played and loved for years, and couldn't afford to go special school events until her friends paid for her tickets to anything she wanted to attend, since her family couldn't afford to buy anything new at that point. I didn't even know such rapid loss of money existed because I was too busy complaining about how many practices I had for my sports that my mom paid thousands of dollars for, and wondering why people were looking at my mom's phone Porsche because it wasn't expensive. *I roll. My dad hates the public school system in our province. Not the universities though, but just elementary high school. He says there should be a rule that wealthy families shouldn't be allowed there because they are taking away opportunities for people who can't afford it. I didn't get it at first, but then I enrolled in a public high school in freshman year, and that's when I noticed firsthand what he had meant. I've always gone to a private Catholic school. It's not that expensive, mind you, and scholarships are really easy to obtain. When I was in public school there was this girl I was classmates with. Our school system worked as blocks, so we were all together every day. Someone told me she was very smart, but comes from a very poor family. She was certainly smart, but couldn't afford materials for school projects, which left some dent in her grades. She joins competitions and qualifies for regionals, but because they didn't have any money she couldn't afford the travel to compete. Guess who replaced her? The second best who could afford it. It's certainly disheartening that the school doesn't even offer to pay for the trip themselves. Anyway, she didn't get the extracurricular points she should've gotten, which lowered her place at the academic rankings. Low ranks means no scholarships for college. I transferred back to private school after that 1 year because that environment just messed with my energy. I always wonder what happened to her after I left. My parents always told me to share my blessings because both come from poor families, which made me too empathetic to people who aren't doing well. I always offered her materials she could borrow, and a few times I noticed she doesn't go out to buy lunch, so I give her food. When we have to photocopy crap she couldn't afford, I'd lend her money and refuse to be paid back because it's literally just cents. I ask myself sometimes if any of our classmates was as helpful to her when I left, because that time no one fucking helped her, and that bothered me so much. Also bothered me that people low-key made fun of her when she was a nice person who didn't deserve that. That was my wake up to the real world. I was never in that kind of cutthroat environment. My parents were very warm to everyone. My classmates from private school only cared about people's personalities and never their status. I remember telling my mom about her and her telling me to do what I can for her because she's been in that place before, and a little help can mean a lot. I hope she's doing well now. I don't even remember her name honestly, but I still think about her every now and then. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe the channel.